A named procedure is much like, or if not exactly the same as an anonymous procedure, other than the fact that you give it a name and you store it in the database, and it becomes what's known as a stored procedure or a database procedure. The point about a stored procedure is that it is executed against the data on the Oracle server. In fact, in the later versions of Oracle, stored procedures can be written in both PL/SQL and in Java. Java stored procedures will actually execute on the server within the database kernel inside an Oracle Server Database Java virtual machine. To get performance out of Java stored procedures, they can actually be recompiled and reconstituted into C-compiled code using a piece of software which was released in Oracle 8i called the Java Accelerator. Another block type piece of modular code in PL/SQL is a function. This is very simple, really. A named procedure is a procedure, a function is a function. Now, if you know anything about programming at all, you know exactly what the difference between these two are. Assuming that you don't know anything about programming, a stored procedure or named procedure is a chunk of code that allows you to put parameters into, but you cannot return a value from it unless you return a value through a parameter. A function in programming theory is a chunk of code that allows you to return one or more values as well as passing in parameters. The real difference between procedures and functions are that functions are compiled and can be embedded by name within other functions. In other words, a function forms what is effectively an expression. A stored procedure could not, for instance, be buried within an expression such as a select statement because it does not return a value. A function could. That's the value of a function. We've already seen a lot of Oracle built-in functions, group by functions, etc. These are functions. In this case, for modular PL/SQL, you would be creating user-defined functions. Another part of PL/SQL is triggers. Triggers are a very interesting thing. In some relational databases, triggers are called rules. In some relational databases, rules and triggers are used to create expert-like systems. Triggers were initially used in Oracle to validate referential integrity between primary and foreign keys in schemas. They can still be used to that effect, but now the better method of coding referential integrity is by using constraints. Some programmers may find it easier to use triggers rather than constraints. However, it is generally accepted practice that triggers are about 10 times slower than the use of constraints. So if you're looking for performance, use constraints and not triggers when coding for referential integrity. A trigger is really what is effectively a database event. It means that something happens in the database and it does what is called, it fires the trigger. In other words, it executes the trigger because something happens. Say a user went and inserted a row into a table which has a type of trigger on that table called an insert trigger. The trigger will detect that insert into the table and it will start executing based on the fact that something was done to that table. That's what a trigger is. Packages are used in Oracle to package stored procedures and functions together in logical packages. There are a number of benefits to using packages. We'll go into those later. Parameters are extremely important, obviously, with procedures and functions. Parameters are passed into procedures and functions to affect the type or the nature of processing within those blocks of code. In procedures, parameters can actually be passed back into the calling procedure, generally as what are called by reference variables. This is something we'll get into later on as well.